A woman's reputation is like a delicate piece of spun sugar. It takes years of meticulous, exhausting labor to build, requiring perfect conditions and unwavering patience. Yet it takes only one violent strike to shatter it into a million irreparable pieces. Evelyn Astor understood this painful truth on a crisp Friday evening, standing in the opulent, gaslit ballroom of her own London townhouse. For 22 years, Evelyn had been the invisible, beating heart behind Astor's patisserie, the most celebrated culinary empire in the city. While her husband, Richard, wore tailored silk suits and charmed the wealthy elite in the storefront, it was Evelyn who spent her nights covered in flour, perfecting the secret family recipes that had made him a millionaire. She was 46 years old, a woman whose elegant auburn hair and warm, tired eyes told the story of a lifetime of quiet devotion. But devotion, it seems, is a currency that loses its value in the hands of a greedy man. The ballroom was crowded with the highest echelon of the city's aristocracy, gathered for what Evelyn believed was a celebration of their new flagship store. Instead, it was an execution. Richard stood at the top of the grand marble staircase, clinking a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute to command the room's attention. He did not look at Evelyn with the pride of a husband. He looked at her with the cold, calculated malice of a man who needed a scapegoat. Richard's business, unknown to Evelyn, was failing. He had gambled heavily on disastrous foreign investments and drained their accounts to fund a lavish, secret second life with a young socialite. To save his own skin and force Evelyn out without a penny, he needed to destroy her. With the entire room watching, Richard raised his voice, adopting the tragic tone of a heartbroken man. He publicly accused Evelyn of embezzling company funds and fabricating a scandalous affair with their accountant. The silence that fell over the ballroom was suffocating. The whispers began almost instantly, sharp and poisonous, buzzing like a swarm of angry hornets. Evelyn stood completely frozen near the velvet curtains. The sheer, audacious cruelty of the lie stole the breath from her lungs. She looked around the room at the people she had hosted, fed, and smiled at for decades. Not a single person stepped forward to defend her. They simply stared, their eyes filled with judgment and cruel fascination. Richard had perfectly orchestrated the ultimate betrayal. He produced forged ledger pages, handing them to the murmuring crowd, cementing the devastating illusion. "I cannot, in good conscience, allow this woman to remain in my home or my business," Richard announced, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I have filed for an immediate separation. She will leave tonight, taking only what she brought into this marriage. If you have ever been the victim of malicious lies, if you know the agonizing pain of watching people believe a false story about your character, please leave a like on this video. Let's show Evelyn that the truth always prevails in the end." Evelyn did not scream. She did not fall to her knees on the marble floor and beg the merciless crowd to believe her. She possessed a profound, unshakable dignity that Richard could never comprehend, let alone steal. She walked slowly to the center of the room, her spine impeccably straight. She looked directly up at Richard. She didn't offer a frantic defense, she merely offered a look of freezing pity. He was a hollow, pathetic man, and in that moment she realized he always had been. Without speaking a single word to the buzzing aristocrats, Evelyn turned and walked up the stairs. She bypassed the luxurious master suite, ignoring the expensive silk gowns Richard had bought with her hard-earned money. She went straight to the small, flour-dusted kitchen office. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk and took out a single worn leather-bound book. It was her grandmother's recipe journal, the true, irreplaceable soul of the empire. She packed it into a modest traveling bag along with 2 simple warm dresses and walked out the servants' entrance into the freezing London fog. She was 46, her name was completely ruined, and her pockets were empty. But as she boarded a late-night train heading far away toward the coast, she felt an unexpected, radical sense of peace. Richard had stripped away her false life, but he had failed to take her true gift. Her hands still remembered how to create magic, and she was going to take that magic to a place where his toxic lies could never reach her. The train rumbled into the dark, carrying her toward the quiet, sleeping village of Willow Creek, and the magnificent empire she was destined to build. The journey to the coastal village of Willow Creek took 2 exhausting days on a train that slowly traded the gray smog of the city for the vast skies of the coastline. When Evelyn stepped onto the wooden platform, the contrast was violently beautiful. There were no shouting newspaper boys, no clattering horse hooves on polished cobblestones, and absolutely no murmurs of high society gossip. There was only the calming crash of the ocean waves against the distant cliffs and the sharp scent of salt water mixing with wild lavender. It was a town that seemed to exist entirely outside the cruel, fast-paced machinery of the modern world. It was exactly the peaceful place where a shattered woman could sit quietly and glue the fragile pieces of her soul back together. Evelyn carried her modest leather bag down the main street. Willow Creek was picturesque, lined with weathered brick buildings, small artisan shops, and ancient oak trees that provided deep, comforting shadows. The locals she passed offered polite, warm nods, completely unaware of the scandalous lies that had driven her from her home. As she walked, her eyes scanned the quiet storefronts, searching for a sliver of hope or a place to sleep. Near the end of the cobblestone lane, exactly where the road curved gently toward the sea cliffs, she found it. It was a small two-story building made of pale stone and faded blue wood. The front window was thick with years of accumulated grime, and the wooden sign hanging above the door had peeled away entirely. But bolted to the heavy oak door was a handwritten sign, "Property for lease. Inquire at the apothecary." Evelyn cupped her hands against the dirty glass and peered inside. The interior was chaotic, filled with overturned chairs and dust sheets, but at the very back of the room her breath caught in her throat. Sitting proudly in the shadows was a massive, beautifully crafted traditional brick baker's oven. Evelyn walked briskly up the street to the apothecary. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman with silver hair and sharp eyes named Mrs. Higgins. Evelyn explained that she wished to lease the abandoned storefront and the small apartment above it. When Mrs. Higgins gently asked for the first 3 months' rent in advance, Evelyn realized she had absolutely no currency. Richard had ensured her bank accounts were frozen before he ever made his public accusation. Without breaking eye contact, Evelyn reached up to her left hand. She slid the heavy, expensive diamond wedding ring off her finger. It was a symbol of a 22-year lie, a cruel shackle that Richard had used to claim ownership over her brilliance. She placed the glittering diamond on the wooden counter, pushing it toward the elderly woman. "I do not have cash, Mrs. Higgins," Evelyn said, her voice perfectly calm and steady. "But this stone is worth enough to pay for a year's lease, a cord of dry wood and enough supplies to fill a pantry. Keep the change. I simply want the keys." Mrs. Higgins looked at the sparkling diamond, then deeply into Evelyn's tired, determined eyes. The old woman didn't ask a single invasive question or judge her strange arrival. She simply nodded, swept the ring into a drawer and handed Evelyn a heavy brass key. If you admire Evelyn's courage to trade her painful past for a brand new future, let us know in the comments. Type freedom, if losing that wedding ring was the best thing that ever happened to her. And please hit that subscribe button. Evelyn unlocked the heavy oak door of the abandoned bakery. The hinges screamed in protest, revealing an interior that smelled intensely of stale air. It was a monumental disaster. The floors were caked in thick dirt, the wooden counters were splintered, and the massive oven was filled with cold ash. A wealthy society wife would have wept at the sight of such overwhelming labor. But Evelyn Astor was a resilient master baker who had built an empire from scratch once before. She rolled up the sleeves of her wool dress, tied a cloth around her hair and got to work. For 3 brutal days she scrubbed the floors until her knuckles were raw and her muscles screamed in protest. She washed the thick grime from the front windows, letting the coastal sunlight flood into the room, revealing the beautiful natural grain of the wooden counters beneath the dust. The physical labor was an incredible medicine. With every bucket of dirty water she threw out the back door, she felt as though she was flushing away Richard's toxic lies and the painful memories of the city. On the evening of the 3rd day, the shop was transformed. It was humble but immaculately clean, a quiet canvas waiting for her art. Evelyn stood before the massive brick oven holding a lit match. She tossed it onto the dry kindling she had carefully arranged inside. The fire caught instantly, illuminating her face with a warm, golden glow that felt like a profound promise. The quiet town of Willow Creek was about to wake up to a smell they would never ever forget. The ocean was still a canvas of deep, ink-like black when Evelyn Astor tied her heavy linen apron around her waist. It was exactly 4 o'clock in the morning, a time when the rest of Willow Creek was buried deep in the quiet sanctuary of sleep. But for a master baker, the hours before dawn were not a time for rest. They were a sacred, uninterrupted meditation. The massive brick oven, which she had meticulously fed with dry coastal oak the night before, radiated a profound, comforting heat that chased away the lingering seaside chill inside the small shop. Evelyn stood at the long wooden counter, her hands sinking into a massive mound of pale, elastic dough. The rhythmic, repetitive motion of kneading was a language she had spoken since childhood. With every push and fold of her flour-dusted hands, she felt the lingering, toxic echoes of Richard's betrayal slowly leaving her body, replaced by the pure, undeniable certainty of her own skill. She had opened her grandmother's weathered leather journal to a very specific page. While Richard had stolen her recipes to build his hollow empire in London, he had only stolen the formulas she had allowed him to see. He had never possessed the true masterpieces. Today, for her grand opening in this forgotten coastal village, Evelyn was not making standard bakery fare. She was crafting delicate golden croissants layered with expensive cultured butter she had bartered from a local dairy farmer. She was baking rustic, heavy loaves of sourdough infused with a hint of wild sea salt, and small, intricate tarts filled with spiced apples and late-season blackberries. The air inside the shop began to transform, shifting from the smell of old dust to a rich, intoxicating symphony of melting butter, caramelized sugar, and toasty, warm yeast. As the clock struck 6, the sky above the turbulent ocean slowly bruised from black to a vibrant, breathtaking palette of violet and burning gold. Evelyn pulled the first heavy iron trays from the roaring oven. The pastries were flawless, a beautiful, shimmering mahogany brown that cracked perfectly as they hit the cool air of the room. She arranged them meticulously on the wooden display counter, the golden crusts catching the early morning sunlight streaming through the clean, expansive front window. Then she walked to the heavy oak door and flipped the small hand-painted wooden sign from closed to open. She propped the door wide open, allowing the crisp, salty morning breeze to carry the overwhelming, irresistible aroma of her baking directly down the cobblestone street of Willow Creek. It did not take long for the magic to work. Within 20 minutes, the usually quiet morning routine of the village was entirely disrupted. Fishermen heading to the docks, shopkeepers sweeping their stoops, and elderly women walking their dogs all paused, their heads turning toward the end of the lane. They followed the golden, buttery scent like ships drawn to a brilliant lighthouse. By the time the clock tower chimed 7, a modest, curious line had actually formed outside Evelyn's door. If you can almost smell the warm, golden bread through your screen, and if you are cheering for Evelyn to succeed on her own terms, please hit that like button. Let's show the world that a woman's true talent can never be silenced by a liar. Evelyn stood behind the counter, a calm, welcoming smile touching her lips for the first time in months. The villagers stepped inside tentatively, their eyes widening at the elegant, mouth-watering display that looked entirely out of place in their humble town. But it was the man who stepped through the door last who made Evelyn's breath catch very slightly. He was a tall, distinguished man, likely in his early 50s, wearing a beautifully tailored, albeit slightly weathered navy wool coat that spoke of a life spent near the sea. His hair was a thick, dark brown, elegantly threaded with silver at the temples, and his face was lined with the quiet, profound wisdom of a man who had seen the world and chosen to return to the quiet. He was Captain Julian Hayes, a retired naval officer known in the village for his vast library and his solitary, observant nature. Julian did not immediately look at the pastries. His striking, intelligent hazel eyes bypassed the golden display and looked directly at Evelyn. He noticed the flour dusting her cheek, the exhaustion hiding at the corners of her warm eyes, and the quiet, fierce pride in her posture. He did not look at her with the greedy, transactional gaze of the London elite. He looked at her with an immediate, profound respect, recognizing a fellow survivor of violent storms. "I have traveled across 4 different oceans, madam," Julian said, his voice a rich, calming baritone that resonated beautifully in the small shop. "And I have never encountered an aroma quite as magnificent as this. I will take 2 of your croissants, and if you would allow it, I would very much like to know the name of the artist who created them." "Evelyn," she replied softly, placing the delicate pastries into a paper sleeve, her heart fluttering in a way she hadn't felt in decades. "My name is Evelyn." The success of Astor's Coastal Bakery was not a slow, gentle incline. It was an absolute, undeniable explosion. Within 3 months, the quiet, forgotten storefront at the end of the cobblestone lane had become the undisputed heart of Willow Creek, and its reputation had begun to aggressively spill over into the neighboring affluent coastal towns. Evelyn's profound culinary genius, unchained from Richard's oppressive dictatorial control, flourished in the salty sea air. Wealthy merchants and aristocratic families who summered on the coast began sending their private carriages miles out of their way just to secure a box of her delicate fruit-filled tarts or her legendary caramelized sugar brioche before she sold out by noon. Evelyn was forced to hire 3 local girls just to manage the relentless lines, while she remained the solitary, untouchable queen of the massive brick oven. For the first time in her 46 years, Evelyn possessed true, unadulterated financial independence. The heavy iron cash box beneath her wooden counter was overflowing with silver and crisp banknotes at the end of every week. She bought new, elegant linen dresses that perfectly complemented her auburn hair, completely replacing the drab, flour-stained rags Richard had preferred her to wear in the shadows of his London kitchen. She was no longer a hidden servant. She was a highly respected, fiercely successful businesswoman. But the wealth and the overwhelming local adoration were not the most beautiful things Evelyn had found in Willow Creek. The most beautiful thing arrived every single afternoon at precisely 3 o'clock. Captain Julian Hayes had become a permanent, comforting fixture in her new life. Long after the morning rush had cleared and the display cases were mostly empty, Julian would walk through the oak door, carrying a thick leather-bound book from his vast personal library. He never demanded her attention, nor did he act with the entitled arrogance of the wealthy men she was used to. He simply ordered a pot of black tea and a single slice of whatever cake she had baked that day, sitting at a small sunlit table by the window. Slowly, the quiet moments between them blossomed into long, profound conversations. When Evelyn wiped down the counters, she would join him at the table, a cup of tea in her flour-dusted hands. Julian was a man of extraordinary intellect and gentle patience. He spoke of the violent typhoons he had navigated in the eastern seas, of the strange, brilliant constellations he had mapped, and of the profound, deafening silence of a ship adrift in the ocean. In return, Evelyn found herself speaking of things she had buried deep within her chest. She did not tell him the full, ugly truth of Richard's lies. Her pride still guarded that dark secret, but she spoke of the suffocating pressure of the city, the feeling of being utterly invisible, and the devastating realization that she had spent 2 decades building a home on a foundation of sand. Julian never offered unsolicited advice, nor did he ever look at her with pity. He listened with a fierce, unwavering attention that made Evelyn feel entirely beautifully seen. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, as a violent coastal storm lashed against the thick window panes, Julian reached across the small wooden table. He gently placed his large, warm hand over hers, his thumb lightly tracing the faint, permanent burn scars on her knuckles, the undeniable physical proof of her years of unseen labor. "You carry the marks of a survivor, Evelyn," Julian murmured, his striking hazel eyes locking onto hers with a devastating intensity. "The city may have blinded those fools to your brilliance, but I promise you, out here in the quiet, your light is the most magnificent thing I have ever witnessed. You do not ever have to hide in the shadows again. If you are completely melting over Captain Julian and his deep, respectful love for Evelyn, please type, 'gentleman,' in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the moment they finally fall in love." Evelyn's breath hitched in her throat. For 22 years she had been starved of genuine affection, treated as a mere appliance by a man who only valued what she could produce. Now, sitting across from a distinguished, highly educated captain who looked at her as if she were the most precious treasure he had ever discovered, Evelyn felt the last remaining walls of ice around her heart completely shatter. She turned her hand over, intertwining her fingers tightly with his, a silent, profound acceptance of the safe harbor he was offering. While Evelyn was finding a beautiful, lucrative peace in the coastal storms, a very different kind of storm was violently tearing through London. Richard Astor sat in his luxurious, gaslit office, staring in absolute horror at the financial ledgers spread across his mahogany desk. Without Evelyn's meticulous, invisible hand guiding the recipes, his flagship bakery was producing dry, tasteless pastries that the high society elite were actively rejecting. The empire he had stolen was collapsing, and his devastating karma had only just begun to arrive. London's high society is a notoriously fickle, unforgiving beast. It will happily tolerate a man's boundless arrogance, his hidden scandals, and even his blatant moral failings, provided he continues to offer them something they desire. But the absolute one thing the elite will never, under any circumstances, forgive is sheer, unadulterated mediocrity. Richard Astor, sitting in the sprawling, cold office of his failing London patisserie, was learning this brutal lesson entirely too late. For 22 years, the name Astor had been utterly synonymous with culinary perfection. Now the glass display cases in the storefront below him were filled with dense, heavy, tasteless imitations that looked right but tasted like sugared cardboard. Without Evelyn's meticulous, invisible hand, her intuitive knowledge of humidity, yeast, and resting times, the hired city bakers were completely lost. The recipes Richard had stolen were merely incomplete outlines. They lacked the soul and the secret techniques Evelyn kept exclusively in her head and her grandmother's journal. The financial collapse had been staggering and violently swift. Aristocratic families canceled their massive catering accounts. The daily lines of wealthy patrons vanished entirely, replaced by polite, devastating letters from furious creditors. And just as the silver coins stopped flowing into his heavy iron safe, the lavish, intoxicating illusions of his personal life completely evaporated. Genevieve, the young, beautiful socialite for whom he had ruined his marriage, possessed the loyalty of a hungry cat. The very moment Richard confessed that he could no longer afford her silk gowns or their expensive carriage rentals, she packed her velvet trunks and vanished into the night, leaving him completely alone in an empty, echoing mansion that he was about to lose to the banks. Richard rubbed his throbbing temples, his once impeccable tailoring looking rumpled and stained with cheap brandy. The silence in his office was oppressive, heavy with the undeniable bitter taste of his own catastrophic karma. He had thrown away a diamond to pick up a shiny piece of glass, and now his hands were bleeding. A sharp, impatient knock on the heavy mahogany door interrupted his miserable spiraling. His nervous, underpaid manager stepped into the room, holding a silver tray with a single half-eaten croissant and a crumbled local newspaper. The manager looked terrified, shifting his weight from foot to foot as if preparing to deliver a death sentence to a volatile king. "What is it?" Richard snapped, his voice hoarse and completely devoid of its usual aristocratic charm. "Sir, Lord Harrington was just in the storefront," the manager stammered, placing the tray on the edge of the desk. He spat his pastry into a napkin. He said it was an absolute insult. But he also left this newspaper from his travels to the southern coast. He told me to show it to you. He said if you want to remember what a real Astor pastry is supposed to taste like, you should take a carriage to a village called Willow Creek. Richard frowned, pulling the newspaper across the polished wood. It was a small regional gazette. Circled heavily in black ink was a glowing half-page review written by a notorious, deeply critical food inspector. The headline read, "The Golden Miracle of Willow Creek, a coastal bakery outshining London's elite." The article described, in agonizing, mouth-watering detail, the exact caramelized sugar brioches and delicate fruit tarts that had built Richard's entire fortune. The inspector claimed that the mysterious, solitary female baker operating out of a tiny stone storefront was producing masterpieces that made Astor's patisserie look like an amateur kitchen. Richard's heart hammered violently against his ribs. The description of the pastries was far too precise. The intricate folding of the dough, the specific spices used in the apple filling, it was impossible for anyone else to replicate it so perfectly. Unless they possessed the original journal. Unless they possessed Evelyn's mind. A sick, twisted sense of desperate entitlement flared in Richard's chest. He convinced himself that the woman in Willow Creek must have somehow stolen Evelyn's recipes after she fled the city. Or perhaps Evelyn had foolishly sold them to a stranger for pennies to survive. He did not for a single second entertain the idea that Evelyn herself was the architect of this booming, successful empire. In his arrogant, narrow mind, Evelyn was a weak, discarded housewife crying in a gutter somewhere. "Prepare my carriage," Richard demanded, standing up abruptly, a wild, manic desperation in his eyes. "I am going to the coast. I am going to find this baker and I am going to buy her operation. If she refuses, I will sue her for stealing my intellectual property. I will not let some coastal peasant destroy my legacy." He grabbed his heavy wool coat and rushed out of the office. He was marching blindly toward his own absolute destruction, completely unaware that the queen he had banished was already wearing the crown he so desperately needed. Karma is finally catching up. If you are excited to see Richard get exactly what he deserves, leave a comment typing karma. And don't forget to subscribe to witness the ultimate showdown. The journey to Willow Creek was a miserable, punishing ordeal for Richard Astor. He had been forced to travel in a cramped, rattling public coach, shivering in the drafty cabin as freezing coastal rains lashed against the thin glass windows. But the severe physical discomfort was entirely overshadowed by the greedy, desperate anticipation burning a hole in his chest. He spent the entire journey meticulously rehearsing his grand entrance and his aggressive legal threats. He would be an imposing, terrifying figure from the capital. He would walk into that humble village bakery, slam his fist on the wooden counter, and demand total submission from whoever had dared to steal his family's culinary secrets. When the coach finally deposited him on the wet cobblestones of Willow Creek, Richard adjusted his damp coat and prepared his most intimidating, arrogant scowl. He marched down the main street, completely ignoring the quaint beauty of the ocean cliffs and the peaceful, salt-tinged air. As he approached the end of the lane, however, his aggressive stride faltered. The building before him was not a humble, struggling peasant's shop. It was an immaculate, thriving, breathtaking establishment. The pale stone walls gleamed, the large front window was pristine, and a tasteful, elegantly painted wooden sign reading the Willow Bakery hung proudly above the door. A line of well-dressed patrons, some clearly wealthy aristocrats from the neighboring summer estates, spilled out onto the sidewalk, waiting patiently in the coastal breeze. The smell of rich browned butter and caramelized sugar hit Richard like a physical blow, instantly transporting him back to the golden days of his own stolen success. He pushed roughly past the line of waiting customers, ignoring their indignant protests, and shoved the heavy oak door open. The bell above the frame chimed sharply. The interior of the bakery was filled with warm, golden light and the cheerful hum of conversation. Behind the long, polished wooden counter, 3 local girls were frantically boxing pastries. But Richard did not look at the girls. His eyes locked onto the massive brick oven at the back of the room, and the woman standing proudly before it. The arrogant demands died instantly in his throat. His mouth opened and closed in absolute dumbfounded shock. It was Evelyn. But she was not the pale, broken, flour-dusted servant he had publicly humiliated and discarded in London. She was radiant. She wore an impeccably tailored, deep forest green linen dress that highlighted her auburn hair, which was pinned back elegantly. The brutal, exhausting physical labor of her early weeks had given her a vibrant, healthy, incredibly powerful glow. Her dark eyes were sharp, bright, and filled with an unshakable, terrifying confidence. She looked like an absolute queen ruling from a throne of golden bread and fire. Richard stumbled forward, knocking a patron's shoulder, his mind completely unable to process the magnificent reality standing in front of him. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of its usual booming authority. Evelyn stopped wiping the wooden counter. She looked up slowly. Her gaze swept over his damp, rumpled suit, his tired, desperate face, and his hollow, panicked eyes. She didn't look angry. She didn't look sad or vindictive. She looked at him with absolute, freezing indifference. It was the exact look one might give a stray, unpleasant insect that had wandered indoors. "Mr. Astor," Evelyn said, her voice perfectly calm, smooth, and chillingly polite. "You are disrupting my customers. If you wish to purchase a croissant, the line begins outside on the cobblestones." Richard's shock rapidly morphed into hot, ugly anger. His fragile ego shattered completely. "Don't you dare play games with me, Evelyn," he hissed, stepping aggressively toward the counter. "You stole my recipes. You ran away to this miserable village to build a business with my intellectual property. We are legally married. Everything you own, everything in this room belongs entirely to my estate. I am taking control of this bakery today." "You are remarkably mistaken," Evelyn replied softly, stepping closer to the counter, leaning forward so only he could hear her freezing tone. "When you publicly declared me a thief in front of 300 witnesses and formally announced our separation, you handed my solicitor everything he needed. The divorce was finalized last month due to your public abandonment and documented adultery. You have absolutely no legal claim to my name, my person, or my business. This is the moment. If you are ready for Evelyn to completely destroy this arrogant man, smash the like button right now. Type "Queen" in the comments to claim her victory. Richard stared at her, sheer panic gripping his throat. He had nothing. "Evelyn, please," he stammered, his arrogance dissolving into pathetic begging. "London is failing. I am ruined. I have nowhere else to go. You cannot turn me away." Before Evelyn could deliver her final blow, a large, warm hand came to rest gently on the small of her back. Captain Julian Hayes stepped out from the sunny window table, his tall, broad-shouldered frame casting a long, intimidating shadow over Richard. The retired naval officer did not yell or draw a weapon. He simply looked at Richard with a quiet, lethal warning in his striking hazel eyes. "The lady asked you to leave," Julian rumbled, his deep voice carrying the unyielding authority of a man accustomed to commanding warships. "I highly suggest you walk out that door before I throw you through the window." Richard looked at the massive captain and then at Evelyn, who stood tall, unyielding and completely victorious. He was utterly destroyed. He turned around, his shoulders slumped in total defeat, and began the humiliating walk back to the muddy road, leaving the Golden Empire behind forever. The bell above the heavy oak door chimed a final definitive note as the last customer departed, leaving the Willow Bakery in a sudden, profound silence. The adrenaline that had surged through Evelyn's veins during her confrontation with Richard began to recede, leaving behind a deep, trembling exhaustion. She stood behind the polished wooden counter, staring at the spot where her ex-husband had just stood. The man who had terrorized her for 22 years, who had publicly humiliated her and stripped her of her home, had been reduced to a pathetic, shivering shadow. He was gone, completely banished from her new, beautiful reality. Yet the physical memory of his cruelty still made her hands shake slightly as she picked up a damp cloth to wipe away the flour. Julian Hayes did not leave when the shop emptied. He moved with the quiet, deliberate grace of a man accustomed to navigating treacherous waters. He walked to the heavy front door, sliding the brass deadbolt into place and pulling the linen shades down, shutting out the prying eyes of the village. The bakery was immediately transformed into a private, intimate sanctuary, bathed in the warm, fading golden light of the afternoon sun and the residual, comforting heat of the massive brick oven. Julian walked behind the counter. He did not ask if she was all right. He simply reached out and gently took the damp cloth from her trembling fingers. He set it aside, turned to the small iron stove in the corner, and began preparing a pot of chamomile tea. The simple domestic gesture, a man of his stature quietly serving her, brought a sudden, overwhelming sting of tears to Evelyn's eyes. "You handled him with the magnificent grace of a queen, Evelyn," Julian said, his rich baritone voice echoing softly in the quiet room as he poured the steaming water into 2 porcelain cups. "He is a coward, completely unworthy of the air you breathe. You never have to look at his face again." Evelyn leaned against the wooden counter, crossing her arms over her chest, finally allowing the heavy, invisible armor she had worn for months to crack. She looked at Julian, seeing the unwavering, protective devotion in his striking hazel eyes, and realized she no longer wanted to carry her heavy secrets alone. "He didn't just leave me, Julian," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling, breaking the silence of the room. "He orchestrated a public execution." Julian stopped pouring the tea. He set the heavy iron kettle down, turning to face her completely, giving her his absolute, undivided attention. Evelyn took a slow, agonizing breath, the painful memories flooding back. "We were hosting a grand ball to celebrate the flagship store. A store I built with my own hands, my own recipes." He stood on the marble staircase in front of 300 aristocrats and accused me of embezzling funds. He forged ledger pages. He told the entire city I was a thief and an adulterer, just so he could discard me without a penny and move his young mistress into my home. I stood there and not a single person defended me. They just stared. He took 22 years of my silent, exhausting devotion and turned it into poison. A single hot tear escaped her eyelashes, tracing a line down her flour-dusted cheek. "I came to this village because I had absolutely nothing else. I was ashamed, Julian. I was terrified that his lies would follow me here, that the world would always see me as the broken, discarded woman he painted me to be. If your heart aches for Evelyn and you are glad she finally has a safe place to share her pain, please leave a like on this video. Let us know in the comments if Julian is the perfect man for her." Julian closed the distance between them. He did not offer empty platitudes or generic comfort. He reached out, his large, warm hands gently cupping her face, his thumbs carefully wiping away her tears. His expression was not filled with pity. It was filled with a fierce, profound fury on her behalf, masked by an overwhelming, tender love. "Listen to me, Evelyn," Julian murmured, his voice thick with emotion, his gaze locked intensely onto hers. "That man did not break you. He merely broke the cage that was keeping your brilliance hidden in the dark. The people in that ballroom were fools, blinded by cheap silk and stolen money. But out here in the quiet we see exactly who you are. You are the architect of your own magnificent empire. You are the bravest, most extraordinary woman I have ever known. And his pathetic lies will never ever touch you here." Evelyn let out a soft, breathless sob, leaning her forehead against his broad chest. Julian wrapped his massive arms around her, pulling her into a deep, fiercely protective embrace. For the very first time in her 46 years, Evelyn Astor felt entirely safe, completely valued and undeniably loved. The passage of time in Willow Creek was not measured by the frantic, chaotic ticking of a city clock, but by the steady, prosperous rhythm of the ocean tides and the golden harvests of the coastal bakery. 6 months after Richard's humiliating departure, the cold, biting winter rains finally surrendered to a breathtaking, vibrant spring. And with the changing of the seasons, Evelyn's empire officially outgrew its humble beginnings. The massive demand for her intricate pastries, rustic breads, and caramelized tarts had completely overwhelmed the small stone storefront. When the ancient 2-story bookshop adjacent to her bakery was put up for auction, Evelyn did not hesitate. Using the heavy iron cash box filled with her own hard-earned profits, she purchased the property outright. She hired a team of local carpenters to knock down the dividing wall, seamlessly expanding her domain. The new addition was not just a bakery. It was the Astor Hayes Tea Room, a sprawling, elegant parlor overlooking the sea cliffs, filled with polished mahogany tables, velvet chairs, and massive windows that captured the brilliant coastal sunsets. Julian had become an irreplaceable fixture in this monumental expansion. While Evelyn commanded the roaring brick oven and the delicate alchemy of the dough, Julian utilized his extensive naval connections to import rare, exquisite teas, rich spices, and fine porcelain directly from the Eastern merchant ships. They operated in a beautiful, silent synchronicity, a true partnership forged in mutual respect. He managed the complex logistics, entirely content to let her stand in the spotlight, incredibly proud to be the steady anchor to her soaring success. On the evening before the grand opening of the new tea room, the village was quiet, bathed in the soft purple light of twilight. Evelyn and Julian stood alone on the outdoor wooden terrace they had built facing the ocean. The salty breeze played gently with Evelyn's auburn hair. She was 47 now, but she looked remarkably younger, her face radiant with health, success, and the profound peace of a life fully realized. Julian stood beside her, his hands resting on the wooden railing, looking out at the endless, darkening horizon. He wore a crisp linen shirt and tailored trousers, having left his heavy captain's coat inside. Evelyn noticed a rare, quiet contemplation in his striking hazel eyes, a vulnerability he seldom revealed. "You have built something truly magnificent here, Evelyn," Julian said softly, the sound of the crashing waves beneath them underhering his rich baritone voice. "This town will remember your name for 100 years." Evelyn turned to him, a warm, affectionate smile touching her lips. She reached out, placing her flour-dusted hand over his. "We built it, Julian. I could not have navigated the merchants, the imports, or the expansion without you. You are as much a part of this place as the brick oven." Julian let out a slow, heavy breath. He turned to face her, his expression incredibly serious, filled with an emotion so deep and profound it stole the breath from her lungs. "When I retired from the Navy, I came to this village to disappear," Julian confessed, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register. "I had spent 30 years commanding warships, navigating violent storms and mapping distant shores. I was a captain, but I realized I had absolutely no port to call my own. I was adrift, Evelyn. I had survived the ocean, but I was slowly drowning in the quiet isolation of my own library." He stepped closer, closing the physical distance between them, his large hands gently lifting hers, holding them against his chest so she could feel the steady, powerful beating of his heart. Then a brave, beautiful woman walked into an abandoned bakery and lit a fire, Julian continued, his eyes shimmering with absolute devotion. You didn't just bring this building back to life, Evelyn. You brought me back to life. You became my compass. You became my home. If you believe that true love is about finding someone who values you as an equal partner, please leave a comment typing equal partners. And make sure to hit that subscribe button for more incredible romance. Evelyn's eyes filled with sudden happy tears. For 22 years she had been a tool for a man's ambition. Now she was the undisputed center of a good man's universe. I don't want to simply manage the tea imports, Evelyn, Julian whispered, slowly dropping to one knee on the wooden terrace, never breaking eye contact. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside rested a stunning vintage sapphire ring, deep and blue as the ocean behind them. I want to be your partner in every conceivable way. I want to wake up to the scent of your baking, and I want to fall asleep holding the most extraordinary woman I have ever known. Evelyn asked her, "Will you marry me?" Evelyn looked down at the man who had seen her at her lowest and treated her like a queen. She didn't hesitate for a single second. "Yes," she breathed, her voice filled with absolute radiant joy. "Yes, Julian. 1,000 times yes." A wedding in the quiet coastal village of Willow Creek was not an event dictated by the rigid, suffocating rules of London's high society. It was not a display of wealth, nor was it a cold, calculated transaction between two powerful families. It was a genuine, joyous celebration of two people who had survived the harshest storms of their lives and chosen to drop anchor in each other's arms. When Evelyn and Julian announced their engagement, the entire village, from the local fishermen to the elderly shopkeepers, seemed to share in their profound happiness. The Astor Hayes tea room and the adjoining bakery were closed for 3 full days, an unprecedented event that only heightened the anticipation. Evelyn, at 47 years old, had never looked more beautiful. The pale, exhausted woman who had arrived on a midnight train with nothing but a leather bag and a shattered reputation was entirely gone. On the morning of her wedding, she wore a simple, breathtaking gown of heavy ivory silk, unadorned by the excessive gaudy lace that Richard had always preferred. Her auburn hair was pinned up elegantly, woven with small sprigs of wild coastal lavender and delicate white sea roses. Around her neck hung a simple sapphire pendant that matched the stunning vintage ring Julian had placed on her finger. The ceremony took place on the sprawling, manicured lawn of Julian's historic stone cottage, situated on a high cliff overlooking the vast, churning ocean. The air was crisp, tasting of salt and blooming wildflowers, the afternoon sun casting a warm golden glow over the 50 guests gathered in simple wooden chairs. When Evelyn walked down the grassy aisle, the string quartet playing a soft, melodic waltz, Julian stood waiting under a rustic wooden archway draped in climbing ivy. The distinguished, towering captain wore his formal naval dress uniform, the dark navy wool contrasting sharply with the bright silver buttons. He did not look at her with the arrogant possession of a conqueror. He looked at her with an absolute breath-stealing devotion, as if she were the only magnificent light left in a darkening world. When they exchanged their vows, their voices carried clearly over the sound of the crashing waves below. They were not the naive promises of youth. They were the deep, profound commitments of two mature souls who understood the true value of loyalty, partnership, and a quiet, unbroken peace. As Julian leaned down to gently kiss his bride, a loud, joyous cheer erupted from the villagers, echoing across the cliffs. The reception that followed was a masterpiece, catered entirely by Evelyn's loyal bakery staff, featuring towering crocum bushes, delicate fruit tarts, and heavy rustic breads that the village had come to adore. It was a day of absolute, unadulterated triumph. While the golden coastal sun set on Evelyn's perfect, joyous new beginning, a very different reality was closing in on the dark, smog-choked streets of London. Richard Astor was completely, devastatingly ruined. The magnificent flagship store he had stolen from Evelyn was gone. The bank had officially seized the property, padlocking the grand front doors and auctioning off the heavy marble counters and crystal chandeliers to pay the massive, mounting debts he had incurred. Richard was no longer a respected member of the elite. He was a notorious, pathetic pariah. The same aristocratic families who had eagerly consumed his lies in the ballroom now crossed the street to avoid him, disgusted by his spectacular financial collapse and the very public departure of his young, greedy mistress. He was currently renting a tiny, damp room above a loud, foul-smelling tavern in the industrial district. He sat on a lumpy, stained mattress, shivering in a worn, threadbare coat that smelled strongly of cheap gin. He held a crumpled, weeks-old copy of a coastal newspaper in his trembling, unwashed hands. The social column featured a small but prominent announcement: the Queen of Willow Creek weds. Evelyn Astor, the culinary genius behind the highly successful Astor Hayes empire, was married to retired naval Captain Julian Hayes in a beautiful coastal ceremony. If you believe that karma always collects its debts in the end, hit the like button right now. Type justice in the comments to celebrate Evelyn's final victory over Richard. Richard stared at the small, grainy photograph of Evelyn smiling radiantly beside her tall, distinguished new husband. The sheer, overwhelming weight of his colossal mistake finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his arrogant ego. He had held a magnificent, priceless diamond in his hands for 22 years, and he had thrown it into the mud for a piece of cheap glass. Now Evelyn was building a massive, lucrative empire and living a life of profound love and respect, while he was quite literally freezing in the gutters of the city. The bitter, agonizing taste of absolute regret flooded his mouth. He crumpled the newspaper and threw it into the dark, empty hearth, burying his face in his hands as the cruel, cold reality of his karma finally consumed him completely. 5 years later, the passage of time had only served to deepen the roots of the Astor Hayes empire and the profound, unbreakable bond between Evelyn and Julian. The quiet, forgotten coastal village of Willow Creek was no longer a hidden secret. It had transformed into a highly sought-after destination for the affluent and the artistic, drawn entirely by the legendary reputation of the massive brick oven at the end of the cobblestone lane. The original stone storefront and the adjoining tea room had expanded once again, now occupying an entire block overlooking the sea cliffs. The bakery employed 24 local residents, providing fair, generous wages and a level of respect that completely revitalized the village economy. Evelyn was no longer the sole, exhausted laborer working in the dark hours before dawn. She had taken on 3 eager, talented apprentices, teaching them the meticulous, magical alchemy of dough, butter, and caramelized sugar, ensuring that her grandmother's sacred journal would live on for generations. Yet, despite her staggering wealth and the massive success of the business, Evelyn refused to adopt the cold, disconnected arrogance of the London elite she had left behind. She still tied a linen apron around her waist every single morning. She still found profound, meditative peace in the rhythmic kneading of rustic bread, and she still greeted her regular customers with the same warm, genuine smile that had charmed the village on her very first day. It was late afternoon on a crisp, brilliant autumn day. The coastal winds were brisk, carrying the sharp scent of salt water and the rich, intoxicating aroma of roasting apples and cinnamon from the bakery's massive chimneys. Evelyn stood on the expansive, polished wooden terrace of the tea room, watching the wealthy patrons enjoy their delicate pastries and rare, imported teas. She wore a beautifully tailored dress of deep, warm burgundy wool, a delicate shawl draped elegantly over her shoulders to ward off the chill. She was 52 years old, and the silver streaks in her auburn hair only added to her striking, regal beauty. The heavy, glass-paneled door leading out to the terrace opened quietly. Julian stepped out, his tall, broad-shouldered frame commanding immediate respect from the nearby tables. At 58, the retired captain was as handsome and formidable as ever, his dark hair now entirely silver, his striking hazel eyes still burning with the quiet, intense intellect that had first drawn Evelyn to him. He carried 2 steaming porcelain cups of a rare, fragrant jasmine tea he had recently secured from a merchant vessel. Julian walked over to Evelyn, offering her a cup with a gentle, affectionate smile. He stood beside her at the wooden railing, his massive arm naturally wrapping around her waist, pulling her comfortably against his side. Evelyn leaned her head against his broad shoulder, sipping the hot, fragrant tea, looking out at the endless, churning expanse of the ocean. "The new shipment of Ceylon cinnamon arrived at the docks this morning," Julian murmured, his deep, rich baritone voice vibrating against her shoulder. The harbor master said the scent was so strong the entire dockyard smelled like a holiday. "The apprentices will be thrilled." Evelyn smiled, her dark eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "They have been practicing the intricate folds for the new spiced brioche all week. They are eager to prove themselves." Julian turned his head slightly, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her temple. "They are learning from the undisputed queen of the coast, my love. It is no surprise they are desperate to impress you." Evelyn set her teacup down on the wide wooden railing. She turned fully to face her husband, her hands reaching up to rest against his strong chest. For 22 years she had lived a life of terrifying uncertainty, constantly managing the fragile ego of a cruel, manipulative man. Now, standing in the golden light of her own magnificent creation, anchored by the deep, unwavering devotion of a man who truly saw her worth, she felt an overwhelming, profound sense of gratitude. "I built the oven, Julian," Evelyn whispered softly, her eyes locked onto his, shining with absolute clarity and deep, abiding love. "But you built the harbor. You gave me the safe waters to finally sail my own ship." Julian smiled, his large, warm hands gently cupping her face, his thumbs lightly tracing her cheekbones. "You were always meant to command your own fleet, Evelyn. I am merely honored to be allowed on board." He leaned down, capturing her lips in a slow, deep, profoundly romantic kiss that tasted of jasmine tea and the absolute, unshakable certainty of their shared life. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the coastal sky in brilliant, fiery strokes of orange and violet. The Willow Bakery hummed with warmth and life, a towering, golden monument to the incredible resilience of a woman who had been thrown into the dark, only to emerge carrying her own magnificent fire.